Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna and you're watching A News. Let's take a look at today's top stories. President Trump says he will impose 100% tariffs on European countries that oppose his push to take control of Greenland. Spain is investigating a deadly train derailment near Cordoba. And Australia has passed tougher gun laws after last month's Bondi Beach shooting. President Trump has doubled down on his tariff threat, saying he will follow through 100% on plans to impose new trade penalties on European allies, unless Washington is allowed to take control of Greenland. Trump said the tariffs would proceed regardless of European opposition and would begin at 10% from the 1st of February, rising to 25% from the 1st of June. The measure would apply to all NATO allies. The move reinforces fears in Brussels that the dispute could quickly escalate into a renewed transatlantic trade conflict. Denmark has warned that any US military action in the island would effectively end NATO. US President Donald Trump has threatened to hit French wine and champagne with 200% tariffs. It's after President Emmanuel Macron declined joining Trump's Board of Peace on Gaza and Trump's threat on the European Union over his wish to take Greenland. Macron has suggested organising a meeting in Paris with Trump and others after the Davos gathering, according to Trump's social media post.
Relations between US President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron seem to be tested. Trump has announced plans to hit French wines and champagne with a 200% tax after Macron declined the invitation to join the Board of Peace on Gaza. It also comes as Trump pushes his desire to take control of Greenland. In a screenshot of messages that Trump posted on Truth Social on Tuesday, Macron suggested he set up a meeting in Paris with the Ukrainians, the Danish, the Syrians and the Russians after the Davos gathering. A source close to Macron said the text message was authentic, according to Reuters. European Union leaders are set to convene in Brussels on Thursday evening for an emergency summit following Trump's threats to impose new tax hikes on several EU countries over his demand to acquire the Arctic island. Responding to questions about Macron's refusal to take part in the Board of Peace, Trump dismissed the French leader's position, suggesting he would soon be out of office. He reiterated that the tariffs would go ahead regardless.
As the EU faces fresh pressure from the US over Greenland and President Trump doubles down on his demand for complete and total control, Brussels has called an emergency summit. The row could test the strength of transatlantic ties at a time of rising global tension. Our correspondent Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where the EU unites as US President Trump doubles down on demands for, quote, complete and total control of Greenland. Trump openly linked his tougher stance on the Danish territory to not winning the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded in December to Venezuela's opposition leader. Last weekend, Trump messaged Norway's prime minister saying he no longer feels, quote, an obligation to think purely of peace after he said Norway did not give him the Nobel Peace Prize for stopping more than 8 wars. Trump said he would now think about what is good for the U.S. and repeated his claim that Denmark cannot shield the island from Russia or China. When asked by a U.S. news outlet if he'd use force to grab Greenland, he responded with no comment. This could come to a head at the World Economic Forum tomorrow, where Trump makes his first appearance in 6 years, giving the keynote address. Speaking from Davos last night, Norway's foreign minister said his country would not be pressured into changing its stance regarding Greenland and that tariff threats would not work. Over the weekend, Trump threatened more tariffs on EU members Norway, Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and Britain. But the EU says the Arctic territory is not for sale. While hosting his French counterpart in Berlin, Germany's finance minister said the two countries will not be blackmailed. The bloc will hold an emergency summit in Brussels this Thursday, preparing options for economic retaliation, including the anti-coercion instrument, which is designed to push back when a foreign power uses trade pressure to force political concessions. The EU may also unleash tariffs next month on 93 billion euros of U.S. imports. On Monday, NATO chief Mark Rutte met with officials from Denmark and Greenland. He later posted on X that they discussed the importance of the Arctic, including Greenland, and would work together as allies. Now, the EU faces a defining test over whether it can defend sovereignty and alliance norms in the face of pressure from the U.S., its closest ally. Giving ground could set a precedent that coercion, not law, shapes outcomes far beyond Greenland. But pushing back risks deeper strain on transatlantic ties at a moment of mounting global rivalry. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
The World Economic Forum in the Swiss town of Davos entered its second day. Dubbing its 56th edition a spirit of dialogue, the WEF's leaders say that given the current uncertainty, getting together to map out a way forward in business and politics is crucial. The WEF agenda has to some extent been overtaken by the US President's dramatic policy moves, including his demand in recent days that the United States annex Greenland. Orkan Amashov joins us now with the details. Hello there, Orkan. Please tell us what the latest situation is on the ground there.
Hello, Dilek. Yes, date of the World Economic Forum annual meeting has started. If yesterday was about preparation for laying the groundwork for the rest of the forum, today is about actual work. And as you said earlier, the landscape is being dominated by the US President Donald Trump. His prospective speech, which is to be delivered tomorrow, they're going to be a 2-hour speech during that session. And naturally, of course, US-Europe tensions, a trade war between them. European plans to punish United States by means of punitive measures. And many people are treating this threat in a very skeptical way. And further US actions regarding Greenland are the subjects dominating the atmospherics here. And beyond that political element, of course, there's wider geoeconomic global dimension to it involving US and China. But in terms of Azerbaijan, in terms of the South Caucasus region, a number of important developments. Yesterday, President Aliyev received a number of chief executive officers and presidents and chairmen of tech companies. And most notably, Azerbaijani energy company SOCAR was awarded with its Digital Lighthouse Award, making effectively SOCAR the first industrial operation inside Azerbaijan. And SOCAR in itself, as an energy company, already holds 3 digital awards of particular nature. And this morning, President Aliyev was interviewed as part of the wider panel discussion, which wasn't a very typical panel discussion. He was interviewed by the Euronews Jane, and many important moments have been reflected upon, including Azerbaijani attitude towards Iran, stability, predictability, middle corridor, and a peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And today, later, 4:15 p.m. local time, there will be a proper panel discussion involving President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, the President of Armenia, and also according to latest information, President of Serbia. And there the key subject will be connectivity, Trump route for international peace and prosperity. Well, World Economic Forum annual meeting is a vast occasion, of course. It's a convergence of geoeconomics and geopolitics. In terms of its size and scale, it's much bigger than Munich Security Conference. But many analysts and observers are saying that after most forums with a similar theme are becoming more or less a particular threat, but the scale is undoubtedly recognized by everybody. Naturally, as I said, this particular tiny alpine Swiss town now feels like a small United States of America. This city feels like a small America, and American presence is very palpable, and also security as well at the highest level. And tomorrow, the speech delivered by Donald Trump is something that people are actually looking forward to.
Okay, Orkan, thank you so much for sharing those developments there, and we'll talk to you again, no doubt, for more updates. And now in other news from Europe, Spain is investigating its deadliest rail accident in more than a decade after a high-speed train derailed and collided with another service near Cordoba. Forensic teams are now working to identify victims while rail traffic between Madrid and Andalusia remains suspended as authorities examine what went wrong.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has declared 3 days of national mourning, as rail operator ADF confirmed that all services between Madrid and Andalusia remain suspended. It's after at least 40 people were killed and more than 150 injured when a high-speed train derailed and collided with another service near the city of Córdoba in southern Spain on Sunday. It's the country's deadliest rail disaster in more than a decade. Local police have set up temporary tents to collect DNA samples from relatives of victims, as authorities began the formal process of identifying those who have died. Spanish authorities say the toll could still rise, warning that additional victims may be found following overnight operations in a hard-to-access rural area near Ademuz. The crash occurred shortly before 8 p.m. local time. The rear carriages of an Irio high-speed train travelling from Malaga to Madrid derailed and crossed onto the opposite line, where it collided with a Renfe service heading from Madrid to Huelva. Officials said the impact knocked multiple carriages off the tracks, with at least 4 wagons fully derailed and some thrown down a 4-metre embankment. The Irio train was carrying around 300 passengers, while the Renfe service had approximately 200 on board. Emergency services said dozens of passengers remain hospitalized, with several in intensive care across Andalusia. Transport Minister Oscar Puente described the crash as highly unusual, noting that it occurred on a recently renovated stretch of track and involved a train that had passed a safety inspection just days earlier. Authorities say human error is not currently believed to be the cause. Investigators from Spain's rail safety agency have launched a formal inquiry, which officials say could take up to a month to complete.
And now to the war in Ukraine. Russia launched ballistic missiles and drones at Kyiv and other regions overnight, triggering explosions and air defense alerts across the capital. In Kyiv, 1 person was injured and buildings were damaged. Power and water outages were reported across eastern districts. Explosions were also reported in Dnipro and Zaporizhia, and a day earlier in Kharkiv, guided bombs hit residential areas, killing 1 woman and injuring 9 others. Hamas said Monday that it is fully ready to transfer administrative powers to a newly formed Palestinian technocratic committee tasked with governing Gaza in the post-war phase. The group said the move is part of the second phase of the Gaza peace deal and reiterated its demand for a full end to Israeli military operations, while stressing Palestinians' right to reconstruction and statehood. The 15-member technocratic committee formally began work in Cairo on Friday, focusing on humanitarian priorities. Fighting, however, has continued. Gaza civil defense officials said 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli fire in separate incidents in Khan Yunis and Rafah on Monday, with airstrikes and artillery shelling also reported. Australia has passed new legislation tightening gun controls following last month's deadly mass shooting in Bondi Beach. The bill was approved in the House of Representatives by 96 votes to 45 and will now proceed to the Senate.
Australia is set to strengthen controls on firearms. The government will introduce new legislation proposing a national gun buyback scheme and provide tougher checks for firearm licences. The bill was passed in the House of Representatives on Tuesday despite opposition from Conservative MPs, with 96 votes in favour and 45 against. It will now proceed to the Senate, where it is expected to pass with the support of the Greens Party. It's after last month's shooting at a Jewish festival, which has been described as the country's deadliest in decades.
The terrorists who killed 15 people on that horrible day had hate in their hearts and guns in their hands. The tragic events at Bondi demand a comprehensive response from government. As a government, we must do everything we can to counter both the motivation and the method. We must deal with the motivation of hatred and the method, the firearms that the attackers used to devastate so many lives. This bill delivers on the government's commitment to address the methods of that attack.
According to the government, there were a record 4.1 million firearms in Australia last year, with more than 1.1 million registered in New South Wales. Meanwhile, New South Wales also passed new laws last month limiting individuals to 4 firearms and farmers to 10, and requiring licence renewals every 2 years instead of every 5.
The sheer number of firearms currently circulating within the Australian community is unsustainable. Research last year highlights over 2,000 firearms are stolen or diverted to the illicit market every year. That's roughly 1 firearm every 4 hours. The fewer legal firearms in the community, the less opportunity there is for them to fall into the wrong hands, including potential violent extremists and serious organised criminals.
The bill was passed without the support of the Liberal National Opposition Coalition, which has criticised Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour government for not doing enough to tackle rising anti-Semitism. Parliament is also debating separate legislation aimed at lowering the threshold for prosecuting hate speech offences.
You have summoned remarkable strength.
We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll discuss Europe's preparations for potential retaliation against the United States and what it could mean for global markets. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Europe is preparing what officials describe as a $93 billion trade bazooka as tensions rise with Washington over US threats to annex Greenland and impose new tariffs. The European Union is considering activating its anti-coercion instrument, a powerful tool that could restrict US companies' access to the single market, raising the stakes for transatlantic relations and global financial markets. Let's bring in our guest, Ricardo Evangelista, financial market analyst, Active Trades, London, UK. Ricardo, thanks for joining us on the program.
Morning, Dilek. Thank you for having me.
Now, a $93 billion retaliation package is being described as a trade bazooka. From a market perspective, how serious is this threat and how unusual is the scale?
I think there are two measures on the table at the moment. One is a tariffs package that is estimated to be worth approximately 93 billion euros. At the moment, it's very much a possibility. The other weapon, let's call it that is also being considered is the so-called bazooka, and this would essentially restrict access to European markets for US tech companies, for example, and it would also entail tariffs on Netflix, for example, on Hollywood films, etc. So I think these two measures are being floated as potential retaliations from Europe should the US proceed with its current stance of wanting to gain the control and essentially absorb Greenland as a new territory. But how likely it is, it all depends on how conversations evolve. We all know that the US administration, the current US administration, has an aggressive negotiating style, moves forward quickly, but quite often retreats, especially when the financial markets show some discontent. So let's see what happens this week. President Trump will be in Davos. Very senior European politicians will also be there. I think it's already been arranged for everyone to meet. So let's see how the situation evolves, and if there is a back down from the US, I'm pretty sure that tensions will very quickly dissipate. If that is not the case, then we could be looking at a scenario where at least one of these measures is actually deployed.
Okay, now let's look at the EU's anti-coercion instrument. How powerful is it, and why has it never been used before?
Well, it's sort of say the atomic bomb of economic measures that the EU has at its disposal. It's never been used before because the EU has never been in a situation similar to the one it finds itself in at the moment. Mm-hmm. So the EU's territorial integrity hasn't been threatened, and in particular, it hasn't been threatened by an ally and by one of its main trading partners. So it's a new uncharted territory here that we are entering. Should this option move forward and become more likely, but it hasn't been used because it's really a weapon that will lead to a situation of lose-lose. So both sides will lose. So this will seriously hurt the US in this case, and large economic powers in the US will be affected and heavily affected. But also it will be extremely painful for Europe, and many of the services that would be affected by this, for example, don't have an obvious European replacement that could be seamlessly deployed in this scenario. So I think it will be an instrument of last resort for the European Union, and it has never been used because the consequences are so devastating for the target, but also for Europe itself.
And Ricardo, if the EU were to activate this instrument, how would markets likely react immediately and over the medium term?
Well, I believe that the reaction from the markets would be very dramatic, and we are already catching a glimpse of what such a reaction could turn out to be. So since yesterday, we are seeing gold rising. So gold is the safe haven instrument most favored by traders during times of uncertainty, and gold has risen to new maximums, is now above $4,700. We've seen that the US dollar is retreating, and over the last 2 sets retreated considerably against other currencies in general, but against the euro in particular, which means that there is at the moment an ongoing repatriation of capital from the US to Europe. We've also seen that stock indices are declining, both in Europe and in the US. Today, even although the market is not yet open in the US, but future contracts for NASDAQ and the S&P are down by almost 1%. So for the markets, for the financial markets, such a scenario would be very positive. And if the EU was to deploy this bazooka, we would be looking at a catastrophic scenario. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but it really would be quite something.
And is this escalation best understood as a negotiating tactic by President Trump, or a genuine willingness to overturn existing economic rules?
I think probably both, I would say. President Trump has a negotiating style that is very unorthodox. He also has a communication style that can be disconcerting, but he has very ambitious plans and a very ambitious agenda, and he likes to move fast and break things and then see what can be done. I think it's both. I think it's a negotiating tactic, but also we should not make when I say we, I mean Europe. We should not make the mistake of taking what President Trump says lightly and the messages carried out by others in his administration lightly. So this has to be taken very seriously, and because the stakes here are very high. But at the same time, there must be serious efforts to de-escalate in the situation, maintain channels open, and continue towards a negotiated outcome, which would really be the best possible scenario, something along the lines of giving President Trump an off-ramp by saying, okay, you can have all these bases here, you can even I don't know, set up new mining projects, and that will be very profitable for American businesses, something along those lines. But every effort must be made towards de-escalating the situation, towards a negotiated outcome, but at the same time, these threats have to be taken very seriously, and there must be red lines that, once they are crossed, must then trigger consequences.
How much leverage does Europe really have over the US economy, and is it enough to deter Washington from following through?
It's almost a commonplace to say that Europe is totally in the hands of the US, and to a certain extent in terms of technology, in terms of defense, in terms of the global banking system, access to the global banking system, and I could carry on. It's true that Europe is so intertwined with the US and so dependent on US-led solutions that on a first look it could appear that Europe is in a weak position. However, the sheer size of Europe and its economic weight mean that it is very important, and the loss of Europe as a partner and as an ally for the US would have enormous costs, would be extremely painful. Of course, it would be even more painful for Europe, but it would be incredibly painful for the US. As I just mentioned, the reaction from the financial markets would also very likely be terrible. And I think that many in the US administration and in the sphere of the US administration have in the past shown that they are very sensitive to these negative reactions from the financial markets. So although Europe appears to be a bit of a toothless tiger, the size of Europe, the economic weight of Europe is enormous, and of course, if Europe was to react in the way to then trigger that pain in the US, of course, it would hurt itself as well, but it would definitely do a lot of damage in the US. So I don't think that Europe is totally devoid of leverage here.
And Ricardo, finally, if Europe prepares this instrument but ultimately doesn't use it, does that weaken EU credibility?
No, I don't think it necessarily does, but it depends how this narrative unfolds, because empty threats could, yes, lead to a loss of credibility, but preparing, having something ready to deploy and then not using it because the desired outcome has been achieved wouldn't represent a loss of face. I think like one US president from the past, Roosevelt, used to say that the best way to negotiate is to speak quietly but to carry a big stick, and I think that's what Europe should be aiming for here.
Okay, Ricardo, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now we'll take a look at major stories from the region. Welcome back to A News. Now we'll take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. The President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, held several key meetings at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He discussed investment, transport and global health cooperation with top international leaders.
President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, held a series of meetings in Davos. One of them was with Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, CEO of DP World. They discussed developing Azerbaijan's transport infrastructure and expanding port cooperation. He also met WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, emphasizing Azerbaijan's support for global health projects and COVID-19 assistance, while exploring prospects for further collaboration. Later, Aliyev spoke with André Esteves, chairman of Brazil's BTG Pactual, about investment opportunities, Azerbaijan's strong macroeconomic position, and potential joint projects with international investors. President Aliyev also met Morten Dierholm of Vestas to discuss renewable energy cooperation, particularly wind power, and promoting Azerbaijan as an attractive destination for foreign investment. Across all meetings, Aliyev highlighted Azerbaijan's stable economy, growing infrastructure, and commitment to global partnerships in trade, finance, health, and energy.
And in an exclusive Euronews interview in Davos, President Ilham Aliyev emphasized the need for peace and stability in the region. He also highlighted Azerbaijan's growing role as a key energy supplier to Europe.
Every country, including Azerbaijan, should think about stability around its borders, beyond its borders. With respect to Azerbaijan, we do not have any potential risks inside the country. All the potential risks can come from outside.
Okay.
Therefore, for us, stability in our neighborhood is something which we always think about, and we've been concerned about some destabilization in Iran. And for us, stability, predictability, and peace in the region is the biggest asset. We suffered from occupation, from war, from losing thousands of victims.
Yeah.
And today, stability and security for every country is the only way to succeed. With respect to energy market, as you see today, oil price is stable. It is at the appropriate level, at least for Azerbaijan. And it demonstrates that situation in Iran, situation in Venezuela, and in other parts of the world do not seriously influence the price of oil. And this is a good sign because producers and consumers, they need to know the predictability of the situation in order to plan their future. So I hope that situation in the Southern Caucasus and around it will not deteriorate. This is what we really wish to see. And I hope that every country will contribute to regional stability and security. And with respect to Europe and European Union, our energy cooperation is growing.
Yes.
We already supply natural gas to 16 countries, and 10 of them are members of European Union. So by this coverage, by geographical coverage of supply of pipeline gas, Azerbaijan is #1 in the world. And for them, it's a way to strengthen the energy security. For us, it's an opportunity to sell our resources on the premium market.
Azerbaijan is marking 36 years since the events of the 20th of January 1990, known as Black January. That year late, on the 19th of January, Soviet troops entered Baku, which was then part of the Soviet Union, to suppress the growing independence movement. In the crackdown that followed, 147 civilians were killed. More than 3 decades on, remembrance events are taking place across the country, honouring the victims and reflecting on a defining moment in Azerbaijan's history.
36 years later, one night in Azerbaijan's capital is still remembered for how quickly ordinary life turned into tragedy. In the final months of the Soviet Union, public anger was growing. Thousands of people were demanding political freedom and greater control over their future. What followed would leave a lasting mark on Azerbaijan's modern history.
January 20, one of the most tragic and defining dates in Azerbaijan's modern history. In 1990, Soviet military forces entered Baku under a state of emergency, using tanks and heavy weaponry against civilians.
The operation began overnight. Large numbers of troops and armored vehicles moved through residential areas, as much of the city was placed under military control. Civilians were caught in the crackdown as force was used to suppress the unrest.
More than 130 people were killed and hundreds were injured during the operation. The intervention was aimed at suppressing Azerbaijan's growing demands for political freedom and sovereignty, but it instead deepened public resistance and became a turning point in the country's independence movement.
Instead of ending the protests, the violence shocked the population and strengthened national unity. Less than 2 years later, Azerbaijan would restore its independence. For many, January 20th remains the moment when the cost of that path became clear. As the country commemorates the anniversary, people continue to arrive at Martyrs Alley in Baku to pay tribute.
Armenia's economy ministry has announced that the country is considering transporting Russian liquefied natural gas by rail via Azerbaijan. This comes as the country faces disruptions in imports from Iran and delays at the border with Russia. Armenian officials have indicated that Russian deliveries through Azerbaijan will commence shortly, although no specific timeline has been provided. The proposal comes amid a recent surge in gas prices in Armenia, which have nearly doubled. Turkey is looking to bring Turkmen natural gas back to its market, with plans to resume imports in 2026. The move comes after a pilot supply scheme and months of technical discussions. Our correspondent reports on what this could mean for both sides.
Turkey plans to resume imports of natural gas from Turkmenistan this year and gradually increase supply volumes. Energy and Natural Resources Minister Alparslan Bayraktar said in an interview with TRT Haber that 2026 is expected to mark Turkmen gas return to the Turkey market. The cooperation builds on a pilot project launched earlier. In March last year, Turkmenistan opened a new export route supplying gas to Turkey under a swap arrangement via Iran. Monthly volumes stood at around 120 million cubic meters, with prices linked to the spot market. The contract allowed for supplies of up to 2 billion cubic meters per year. However, deliveries were temporarily suspended in October. Turkmengas said the pause was technical in nature and related to addressing issues identified during the pilot phase of cooperation. Despite the interruption, Turkmenistan's position in the Turkey market has strengthened. In May 2025, the country entered Turkey's top 5 natural gas suppliers for the first time. Supplies are delivered through existing pipelines via Iran, a route of strategic importance for both sides. For Ashgabat, it offers a chance to diversify exports, and for Ankara, it strengthens energy security. And against this backdrop, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited Turkmenistan last December, where energy cooperation, including natural gas supplies, featured prominently on the agenda. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Several Iranian-made messaging apps were restored early Tuesday, allowing users to access group chats, posts and multimedia features. However, nationwide internet restrictions remain in place. Iran's top cyberspace authority said full access will only return once security conditions are fully confirmed. Google search services were restored on Sunday, a day after SMS services resumed following a 10-day nationwide blackout. Iran imposed the restrictions on the 8th of January, citing unrest and security threats across the country.
Disrupt online business.
Iranians are urging authorities to listen to their grievances and allow for peaceful expression after weeks of intense, deadly protests nationwide. However, concerns over rising prices still remain, and residents call for the right to peaceful expression.
In Iran's capital in Engelab Square, burnt-out vehicles and damaged buildings have yet to be cleared following deadly protests, which left several streets badly affected in Tehran. And now Iranian residents are calling on authorities to hear public concerns and permit peaceful demonstrations. The protests erupted in late December about rising prices and were among the most violent in years. Local resident Kayhan Golami says the government should provide peaceful channels for people to voice their worries and listen to public demands.
A series of price hikes have occurred in the past few days, such as the high dollar exchange rate and rising oil prices, and these have fueled the fire of people's rage. In my opinion, the government should have acted more wisely on this, rather than suddenly raising prices and prompting people to protest in this way.
Another resident, Mehdi Yazdi, also calls for greater freedom of expression.
The government should at least listen to the people and understand what they are saying and what is happening in society with these high costs and this economic situation. I am a young person myself who cannot do anything about this economic situation in my life. At the very least, we should have freedom of speech, so we can express our protests somewhere and be heard.
Iran's streets have been largely quiet for about a week, according to officials and social media posts after weeks of unrest. An Iranian official, speaking anonymously, said more than 5,000 people were killed, including members of the security forces, with some of the worst violence reported in the country's northwest.
Afghanistan is enduring a worsening humanitarian crisis. Freezing temperatures and severe food shortages are leaving millions helpless, with many struggling just to get their next meal. Aid agencies warn the situation could get worse without urgent international support.
Aid agencies say Afghanistan is facing an escalating humanitarian crisis. Freezing temperatures and severe shortages of food and resources have left millions struggling to survive. Across the country, families are living in makeshift shelters, burning scraps of wood and rubbish just to stay warm.
We live here out of necessity and hardship. Whatever is within our power, we will do. Our hearts long for many things, but we simply cannot afford them. When the wind and rain come, we hold our children close and keep going because we have no choice. The children cry that it's cold, but what can we do? We endure because we have to. There was a time we went hungry for 2 days. I had only 50 Afghanis, 75 cents. And with that small amount, we bought bread for the children. We tore it into pieces and shared it among them. Adults can endure hunger, but children cannot. For 2 days, we survived on just 50 Afghanis.
It comes as Iran and Pakistan have expelled more than 2.5 million Afghans, according to the World Food Programme. Work opportunities are scarce, and many households rely entirely on humanitarian assistance. Clinics report a surge in malnourished children, while aid distribution points are overwhelmed, with supplies falling far short of need. The United Nations WFP warns that around 17 million are at risk of severe hunger, a situation worsened by sharp cuts in international aid.
Well, hunger is rising at an alarming rate here. 1/3 of the population are experiencing acute hunger, and that is 3 million more people than last year. So the situation is dramatically worse than last year. What we're finding is a confluence of factors. There's a drought in the north. Malnutrition is rising exponentially. We have the return of 2.5 million people this year to Afghanistan, the forced return. All these things are coming together to create a perfect storm for Afghanistan.
Cuts to global aid have left organizations stretched and families without support, with long queues at distribution centers highlighting the scale of the crisis.
We'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll mark the anniversary of the Black January and reflect on its lasting impact on Azerbaijan's history and independence. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now let's bring in our guest Murat Muradov, Deputy Director at Topçubaşov Center, Baku, Azerbaijan. Murat, welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting.
Now, why does Black January remain such a defining moment in Azerbaijan's national memory?
Well, I think that the sheer sacrifice that Azerbaijanis have made on that day. I mean, like, I myself haven't witnessed those tragic days of history, but my parents and then many people who survived it. So remember how hundreds of thousands of people, they went to the streets, they were ready to risk their lives at night, just trying to rescue the injured and to bring the dead to hospitals. And then the next day, when also this huge crowds marched on the streets to pay the tribute to those fallen, I think they have changed the psyche of the nation forever. And there was a sense of unity, which had been suppressed for decades before, I think revived once and for all. And after that day, we see like thousands of Azerbaijan's national flags being hoisted by citizens everywhere. And I think also the feeling that the Soviet army is not people's army anymore. It's an invading force which just brought blood and tears. I think it has been somehow enshrined in the memory of people.
And what was happening politically and socially in Azerbaijan in early 1990 that led to the Soviet leadership to use force?
Yeah, I think actually it's a justification which the government in Moscow used for this barbaric, attempt to curb the national movement. It's in itself very cynical because, of course, indeed, before that, I mean, the slow brewing tension between Azerbaijanis and Armenians had been ongoing, and there were already pogroms and also more than 100,000 of Azerbaijanis from Armenia were expelled from their homes. Yeah, there were riots in the different cities. But instead of trying to restore the justice and to, first of all, which was needed from the Soviet government, was to express an unambiguous position on this nascent Karabakh movement. They demanded the so-called reunification of Armenia, which actually meant also the exodus of also thousands of Azerbaijanis and tragedies, families being kicked out of their homes. Well, instead of resolving this root problem, well, the Saudi government started to present this as, as a nationalist uprising, and pretended that this troops entering Baku is an attempt to save, let's say, the Armenian population of the city, which of course was completely false. And I think basically the central government, by doing this, just it's served to undermine the legitimacy of the Soviet rule, and also instilled unforgettable bitterness in all Azerbaijanis.
And 147 civilians were killed, Murad. How did that scale of brutality change public opinion at the time?
Well, yeah, as I said just before, well, first of all, of course, the legitimacy of the Soviet government was undermined. The image of the most humane, most, internationalist, let's say, Soviet officer was shattered. And, I think Azerbaijanis were maybe the first, say, people of, among all the Soviet republics who faced really this brutality in all its brutal scope. And it's kind of anticipated what will happen later in Chechnya, in Ukraine, elsewhere. Also, I think what mattered is that the international reaction to that tragedy was very bleak. I would say criminally bleak, and there were voices, including, let's say, the then U.S. President George Bush Sr., who directly supported Moscow's actions, as saying that it was an attempt to restore order. Also, international media widely campaigned to portray this events in Baku as a uprising of Islamic extremism, and then, of course, by definition, the Soviet response, the government response, was something to be supported. And I think also, Azerbaijanis, except for this, I'd say, hatred of the Soviet government, it also brought this mistrust towards international media, let's say, international law, which was silent. And I think something what now the whole world can witness, basically, in many examples. The cynical, let's say, lack of respect to basic international norms of sovereignty, etc. We have witnessed it decades ago, in the 1990s. So I think we are more ready, to this current turmoil in international politics than many other countries.
And when you look back at that time, do you think Black January accelerated rather than suppressed Azerbaijan's push for independence?
Well, it definitely accelerated it. And I must say that, the Soviet repression at the time were at the same time brutal and inconsistent. So we witnessed, a lot of crimes committed on that day, and then arrests of a number of prominent national figures. But at the same time, there was a lot of neglect, to fulfill basic government duties. when it comes to Karabakh, etc. And of course, the inconsistency fueled the movement. And also, of course, the whole total socio-economic situation around the Soviet Union, also the fact that many other republics also were demanding independence, starting from Georgia and Baltic countries and Ukraine. It's, of course, it all undermines Moscow's capacity to act. And I must recognize that, many prominent national activists, let's say, other Soviet countries, starting from our people in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the Baltic Popular Front, and many others, all unambiguously condemned Moscow's actions. and try to bring more international attention. So that's why in the first months of the tragedy, the truth started to also unfold. And I think they all played a big role in why Azerbaijan national movement, which of course experienced a shock in January 1999, got only stronger. And in the end of the day, achieved its ultimate goal.
Okay, Murad, thank you so much for joining us on the program. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much.
And you're up to date with world news for the hour. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.